You had asked that I talk a little bit about my career journey and working for the Nature Conservancy before launching into the presentation. Um, so I am a senior conservation scientist with the Nature Conservancy here in Michigan. I've been here with the Conservancy in Michigan for going on 24 years, so my entire professional career. And I started here just as I was finishing up a PhD at the University of Michigan. And my PhD was in forest ecology and landscape ecology, and my dissertation involved mapping and classifying landscape ecosystems at the University of Michigan Biological Station. So a lot of field work, learning about the ecosystems of Michigan in the field and through mapping and delineating different kinds of ecosystems. And in the process, in the years as I was doing my PhD at U of M, I got to meet some folks at the biological station who happened to be on the board of the Michigan chapter of the Nature Conservancy. One Dr. Edward Voss, who was a prominent botanist here in Michigan for decades, and another bryologist and mycologist, Dr. Barb Madsen. They're both on the board. And as I was approaching the end of my PhD, this is rather serendipitous actually, they informed me of a position that was opening up in Michigan that they thought I would be well suited for. And so I looked into it. I had been a member of the Nature Conservancy since I was an undergrad, so I knew a little bit about the group, the organization, and I thought it could be a good fit. And so I applied and got an interview, got to meet some of the staff, really liked the person who would end up being my supervisor in the interview process. And I was offered my first job as a conservation planner. So, I was pretty, I can't say that I followed a precise plan. I was pretty naive in my undergraduate and graduate education. And I happened to be, it was the people that I knew. And in working with those people in close proximity at the biological station, that's kind of how I got with the Nature Conservancy. And I've been, since being first hired, I've been a conservation scientist. That's my title now, senior conservation scientist and planner throughout that time. And so I've helped us to develop strategies for achieving our mission, both at a very local scale and at a very broad scale. And what I'm going to talk about today is an example of conservation planning at a broad scale for an entire Great Lake. And I've also done a little bit of field research and monitoring, but I don't get out in the field as much as I sometimes would like to. But I do get to work with hundreds of people in my career across the Great Lakes Basin, and I'm very grateful for that. That's always invigorating. And the people at the Nature Conservancy are, really 90% of aside from the mission, 90% of the benefit is just working with great people. So that's just a little bit about my career. I don't know if there are any questions about that. It's a little hard to replicate, I understand, but I guess if you're looking for some insights, as I said, I was fortunate to meet people in the course of my graduate work, and not everyone can have that opportunity. So, and this is pretty obvious, but I emphasize it all the time, is find a way to either volunteer or even get paid internships as you're going through your career. And I understand many of you are professionals, and so you're kind of past that point, but continue to make connections and make yourself valuable to those people that you're making connections with. So I guess with that, I'll get started here. So I'm going to talk, Tim asked me to talk about the Lake Erie Biodiversity Conservation Strategy, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk just a little bit first about the Nature Conservancy. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a conservation organization, a global conservation organization. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And we have a vision that of a world where the diversity of life thrives and people act to conserve nature for its own sake and its ability to fulfill our needs and enrich our lives. And I think this is really a Nature Conservancy. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a conservation organization, a global conservation organization. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And we have a vision that of a world where the diversity of life thrives and people act to conserve nature for its own sake and its ability to fulfill our needs and enrich our lives. And I think this is really important in that we're still focusing on nature for its own sake, as we always have since our founding over 60 years ago. But we are also recognizing that people depend on nature and nature depend on people. They're intertwined, and there's no way you can improve one without also thinking about and caring for the other. Okay, so as I said, we've been around for over 65 years. We're global. We have 1 million members worldwide. Our staff of roughly 4,000 includes at least 600 scientists. Not all of them in science positions like myself, but many of them. We've conserved over 100 million acres worldwide, and that doesn't mean that we own 100 million acres. That means that we own a lot. I believe we own over 1 million acres, but we also have protected many more than that by working with governments and private partners in now 72 countries globally. And we do that in a number of different ways. We protect habitats throughout the world. I'm not going to read through this. We address threats to conservation, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those threats might be in this presentation. And we use a non-confrontational, pragmatic, and scientific approach. All of our work is based in science. Just today, I was informing one of our government relations staff working to influence lame duck legislation in the state of Michigan so that it has less of a negative impact. And we're bringing our science to bear through that process. And it's an important approach. So it's not necessarily adversarial, but it is science-based and pragmatic. We focus on healthy waters, thriving coasts, resilient forests, and we have science and policy work, as I just mentioned. And we've protected close to 400,000 acres here in Michigan. And again, we own maybe 50,000 in our system of nature preserves. So the rest has been protected through partnerships. So this project, Returning to a Healthy Lake, is an international biodiversity conservation strategy for Lake Erie, and I co-led this project with John Paskus of the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and we had a core team of several TNC staff and also worked closely with Nature Conservancy Canada. They're a different organization, very similar in approach and mission, based in Canada, obviously, and Dan Kraus has been a lead in many biodiversity conservation strategies. So I just mentioned our partners. We worked with a broad network. We had a steering committee of roughly 50 people from around the basin, binational, all states represented, developing strategies for the restoration and conservation of the native biodiversity and ecosystem function. And the primary output is the biodiversity conservation strategies that will complement and be incorporated into the lake-wide action and management plans. So just a brief word about that. The lake-wide action and management plans are documents. There's one for each Great Lake, and they are developed through binational partnerships under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So every Great Lake has a partnership comprising representatives from agencies at the federal and state level, and also tribes and First Nations that make consensus decisions about managing these lakes. And right around 2009, both the US EPA and Environment Canada, which is the counterpart of the US EPA, made it a priority to incorporate specifically strategies for biodiversity conservation. And they started with Lake Ontario and then moved on to the other lakes. This project was funded through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in the US EPA, primarily with additional funding from Environment Canada. That's now, by the way, Environment and Climate Change Canada. We used a process, conservation planning, and that's not showing up. Okay, there's a 4-part cycle there for conservation action planning, and it includes setting priorities. The first 2 are the ones that work. Identifying what essentially our conservation targets are, and then doing the planning, setting priorities, and then taking action and measuring success. Really, in these biodiversity conservation strategies, it's the first 2 steps. Our project did not involve any direct action. It is meant to inform action. I'm sorry that graphic is not showing up. That must have been something about the transfer.
Yeah, I think it's the
Okay,
transfer
so
PDF to, PowerPoint, whatever. Like,
okay, so here are the components. So this will cover those steps. Defining the biodiversity conservation targets. So these are the things that we are of interest that are to be conserved. Assessing the viability of those, essentially the health or the status. And we developed 110 indicators for those in that process. Identifying critical threats, developing strategies to address those threats, and then identifying priority areas. And in this case, we were focused entirely on coastal biodiversity. And then for this one, we incorporated an ecosystem services assessment that I'll talk briefly about later on, and then provided recommendations for implementation. Because Lake Erie and all the Great Lakes are pretty diverse from one end to the other, and they have a wide array of habitats, we stratified, skipped ahead. We stratified the lake into 4 reporting units, and those are the 4 large units you see there. The maroon color, Huron-Erie Corridor, the Western Basin in dark blue, the Central Basin in lighter blue, and then the Eastern Basin in green. And the smaller units are assessment units, and there are 3 different types. There are coastal nearshore units, and actually 2 types, coastal nearshore units, and then offshore units. And we reported on viability in each of those units. So our biodiversity targets in the aquatic targets were open water, benthic, and pelagic ecosystem in the nearshore zone. That's essentially the deep water and the shallow water, using dividing depth of 15 meters. So anything less than 15 meters in Lake Erie was considered nearshore. Greater than 15 meters is considered offshore or open water. Native migratory fish, coastal wetlands, and then the Lake Erie connecting channels, which are the rivers and smaller lakes that connect the Great Lakes. The terrestrial targets include islands, and there are some very important islands in Lake Erie. Coastal terrestrial systems, essentially systems within 2 kilometers of the coast. And there are a variety of different coastal systems, including beaches and dunes and different kinds of beaches and coastal wetlands, aerial migrants as well. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about how we did the viability assessment. We identified what we called key ecological attributes, and that you see the abbreviation here, KEA. And these are categories of metrics by which we can assess the health or the viability of a particular target. So we see different kinds here, and they're in different categories of condition, size, and landscape context. Here we see some of the condition attributes, including up here food web linkages, and one of the indicators there is the hexagenia mean density. So hexagenia are mayflies. There are other benthic invertebrates that are also important for the food web in the nearshore zone. And down here we see more of a physical parameter than near shore, and these are bedload traps and groins that have been constructed, and those are important for sediment stability and movement in the near shore. For each indicator, we developed ratings in categories of poor, fair, good, and very good, and where possible, these are based on literature. In some cases, they're based on expert opinion, and so we had staff, we divided up our core team, and every core team member took a particular conservation target, identified the experts who knew about these systems, and then engaged them in a series of calls and webinars to develop and agree upon these ratings. And then, where possible, we found data to assess the current status. Now, as you can see by all of these blank cells, we don't have, at the time we did the Lake Erie biodiversity strategy, we did not have data for every indicator. So there are a lot of blanks. But in many cases, we did have data, and we were able to assign the current status of each one of these. And you can see our stratification units here. The Huron-Erie corridor, the Western Basin, Central Basin, Eastern Basin, and then the coastal units within each one, or the assessment units, coastal and offshore. So for some things, we had a lot of data. Others, we didn't. But the experts agreed that even those for which there were no data, those are important, and it's a signal that there should be data collected. So the nearshore zone, overall, you can see here in the assessment units the current status as of 2011. So anything that's in a yellow or orange color in the nearshore is rated as fair. And what fair means is that it's below what we would consider to be acceptable viability, below the range of natural range of variability. But that with restoration, it's restorable. If it's red, it's considered perhaps not restorable, or at least without a heavy investment of resources beyond restoration. So we can see that most of the units, the nearshore units in Lake Erie, were assessed as fair, and there were a couple that were poor. Overall viability. I'm not going to go through all the targets. I'll go through a few. So here's coastal wetlands, and we can see in those same units a lot of orange. So a lot of these units were considered to be in fair condition for coastal wetlands. Now the Ohio and western Pennsylvania shore of Lake Erie was considered to be good. So the coastal wetlands, even though they're not very extensive in this part of the lake, were considered to be in good condition. Native migratory fish, there's a lot of variability around the lake. And what contributed to this variability was really the connectivity. So migratory fish are fish that live part of their lives in the lake and part when they migrate up into tributary streams. And so the tributary connectivity is a really important indicator, and in many cases, for large parts of the lake, those tributaries are blocked by dams or impassable road stream crossings and those kinds of barriers. So you can see kind of at a glance the importance of that connectivity in different parts of the lake, where the North Shore along in Ontario is in good condition. Other places are in poor condition, and also we see some fair condition migratory fish. So that was 3 of the 8 conservation targets, actually. Haven't visited this in a while. So if we look across all of them, we can get a sense of the overall status of biodiversity in Lake Erie. And again, this is 2011, so it may be a little bit dated, but you see a lot of yellow. So a lot of these came out as fair. There were a few that came out as good, including aerial migrants, and that's primarily birds, in the Huron-Erie corridor and Western Basin. And then coastal wetlands in the Central Basin and on islands, and you just saw a little bit of that, or islands in the Central Basin. Those are in good condition. So there's only one conservation target that if you kind of aggregate those ratings lake-wide, that would be considered in good condition, and that's the aerial migrants. All the others are fair. So it's important to consider, though, that fair is somewhat of a, when you aggregate multiple multiple ratings across many different indicators in multiple reporting units, you're missing a lot of their variability. So it really does help to dive into the detailed indicator ratings if you really want to take action and try to improve some of the condition of these conservation targets. So you can see here the proportion of indicators for each target that are within different rating categories. And you can see, for example, that coastal terrestrial systems, more of the indicators are in poor than fair, and yet that still came out as fair. In contrast, the aerial migrants, and migratory fish, most of the indicators actually are rated as fair. So there's a lot of detail behind those very broad ratings, and it helps to dig into that detail to have a better understanding. We don't have time to do that today. We engaged our core team and many other partners in an online survey to assess threats throughout the basin. And you can see here, these are the threats ranked that came out with at least one high ranking in at least one of the 4 reporting units. So there were other threats that we assessed. These are the ones that came out highest. So at the top, invasive aquatic species, climate change, specifically habitat shifting, and that didn't come out very well on this slide here, but invasive terrestrial species, pollution from agricultural and forestry sources. And that is, for Lake Erie, that's agriculture, that's not forestry. Development, urban development, and then shoreline alterations. Oh, I'm blanking on that one. I can't even read it on this slide. And then the last 2 are industrial and urban pollution. So this threat assessment really guided the development of strategies. And so we developed strategies for those high-ranked threats. So if we think about agricultural non-point source pollutants, that's the one that's gotten the most attention in Lake Erie. It is the primary cause of the harmful algal blooms that you may, I'm sure you've heard of, that shut down the water in Toledo a couple years ago for 500,000 people for 3 days. Another one, prevent, detect, and control invasive species, and we did split out aquatic and terrestrial in that strategy development. Promoting compatible housing and urban development and shoreline restoration. So that's addressing threats of development along the shore. Reducing urban non-point and point source pollutants. Removing and mitigating dams and barriers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So here's the ag non-point source pollutant strategy. We developed 2, actually. This is the one that got the most attention. The first one there, target and intensify nutrient management, BMPs, to reduce soluble reactive phosphorus loadings. So there you are. Phosphorus loadings from ag sources are the real culprit in many of the water quality issues. And in fact, that's the only one of these that has actually, for which a binational goal has been set. So the nations of Canada and the United States have agreed on a 40% reduction of phosphorus loadings. Now, I can't claim that this biodiversity strategy led to that, but we finished this up in 2012. In 2014, the International Joint Commission published a balanced diet for Lake Erie, the LEAP report, it's called, the Lake Erie Ecosystem Priority, or LEAP report. And you can see here the very first recommendation is setting phosphorus reduction targets. So again, that I can't claim that we caused that. This discussion was already going on, but at least it provided some focused discussion around this threat that was then followed up on by the IJC. Related to that is promoting infield management of drainage and management of surface drainage channels to moderate discharge. So trying to control the water running off the fields. Another one was prevent, detect, and control invasive species. So there were several terrestrial species strategies, and I'm not going to read through these, but there's a lot of focus on Phragmites or common reed. And in fact, there has been formed a binational collaborative effort called the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. And it's pursuing many of these same strategies here. And you can find more information. I've provided a link to that collaborative group there. On the aquatic invasive species side, there's a lot of work as well, and uh, there, especially, the threat of Asian carp has really motivated a lot of investment and energy in both the science for, survey, early detection, and rapid response, but also in trying to prevent that group of fish from entering the Great Lakes. So, and this is just a screenshot of a website that I'm going to mention later on in the presentation. Coastal conservation strategies. I'll talk about an example of this later, but really building a business case for coastal conservation and developing a comprehensive education outreach shoreline softening program. For urban non-point and point source pollutants, improving stormwater management and green infrastructure. The Nature Conservancy in the city of Detroit is now implementing both of those, working with the city itself. There's a lot of work going on in the Eastern Market, if any of you are familiar with Detroit, and trying to find creative ways of financing green infrastructure to reduce runoff and combined sewer overflows. Removing and mitigating dams and barriers. There's a lot of science right now on this strategy of increasing connectivity to Lake Erie, focusing on first barriers. This is a slow-moving strategy, but there is, again, a lot of interest on this. There's a challenge in that those barriers, while they are preventing our migratory fish from getting into their spawning habitat, they are also preventing the sea lamprey from getting up into that same habitat and reproducing even more drastically than it is now. So that's a conundrum that people still haven't figured out how to address. So that's an ongoing process. We used what we call results chains to tease out details in these strategies. And I'm not going to go into the detail here, but this is a process of really testing the assumptions behind each of the strategies. And we did this with groups of individuals, again, representing multiple perspectives. And the ag non-point source strategy was the one that really took up a lot of attention and time to develop. So you can find more information in the report on that and in more recent documents, actually. So I mentioned an ecosystem services assessment. We did this kind of to pilot the idea of that by identifying the services provided by Lake Erie and its coastal systems, and connecting those services to values that people value, we can better communicate the importance of those ecosystems and focus interventions or strategies in ways that would benefit both people and nature. So while we didn't develop any strategies, there was supposed to be a graphic here. So you'll have to look at the one that I saved, or that I've uploaded to see that graphic. I'll share the PDF when I'm done here. I'm going to pride now. So I guess just one more word on the ecosystem services survey. At the same time we did the Lake Erie biodiversity strategy, we also did one for Lake Michigan, and we conducted this ecosystem services assessment in both lakes using the same approach, using the same list of 32 ecosystem services. And while the order differed, the order of importance among those services differed a little bit, the top 10 out of those 32 were exactly the same in both lakes. And these are different people doing the survey. And so that was kind of an interesting result. And so we included those 10 in some additional work as a follow-up, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So how has the Lake Erie Biodiversity Conservation Strategy influenced the planning and management in the years since it has been produced? Well, I mentioned that a purpose was that these biodiversity strategies for all the Great Lakes would be in some way incorporated into the lake-wide action and management plans. Well, right now, the Lake Erie Lake-wide Action and Management Plan is being rewritten. They revise them every 5 years for each lake. And I have been able to sit in on the work group discussions and comment on the chapter on habitat and species because of the role that we played in developing the biodiversity conservation strategy. So I've been able to incorporate the findings from that process into the LAMP that is being drafted now. I already mentioned the LEAP report. Well, some of the viability indicators from the biodiversity strategy informed recommendations in this report. I talked about the phosphorus recommendation already. Well, here's one that is a recommendation to both federal governments and Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario should commit to a goal of a 10% increase by 2030 beyond current levels of coastal wetland areas in the western basin of Lake Erie. This is about reducing nutrient pollution and promoting biodiversity, but that 10% increase is exactly what we recommended in the biodiversity strategy. So even though this goal was it was not based in literature, it was based on expert opinion, and it is somewhat arbitrary, it has been picked up, and it is setting, influencing the goals that are held by the lake-wide community going forward. Another way it's being applied is in a current effort, and that's an effort to track progress towards goals for key Great Lakes issues. So this is blueaccounting.org, and we're part of this effort along with the Great Lakes Commission, and one of the issues is coastal wetlands. And you can find out more at blueaccounting.org. We're working with a basin-wide collaborative group called the Great Lakes Coastal Assembly to set goals for coastal wetlands, and the biodiversity strategy is playing a key role in informing that goal development. So here, for example, is a map of investments in coastal wetland restoration and protection that is now available on blueaccounting.org. You can go and interact with this map where it'll show you all of the investments. These are just GLRI, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects, and some coastal management program investments in Michigan and Wisconsin. So it's not a complete set yet. We're working on that. But these are projects implemented for coastal wetlands around the basin. And it tells you how much has been invested and what year it was invested in. You can also find out what kind of project, what kind of recipients have been funded, and we're building this so that ultimately we'll also be able to provide information on the results of those investments. So again, the biodiversity strategy is informing the goals for which Blue Accounting will track progress. And the same for aquatic invasive species. This is one of the other issues on Blue Accounting. And these goals, if you compare them with the goals for aquatic invasive species or in the biodiversity strategy, you'll see a lot of similarity. Another local example I was reminded of just today when I was speaking with someone involved in the St. Clair Detroit River System Initiative. They have developed clear objectives for their area from Lake St. Clair, the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, the Huron or Detroit River, and Western Lake Erie that are based on the viability indicators and criteria established in the biodiversity conservation strategy. So they're stepping down the strategy to a more local area and taking a more precise approach to implementing objectives to improve the viability of the biodiversity in this region. And my contact specifically mentioned for coastal wetlands and shoreline softening. So it's informing that work at a local scale. And then I mentioned that we did the ecosystem services assessment. Well, that has informed a coastal conservation visioning project that we did for Western Lake Erie, including Ontario, Ohio, and Michigan, the coastal region there, in which we identified priority areas for conservation and restoration to optimally achieve regional ecological goals, and enhance human well-being. So we use the ecosystem services assessment to inform what socioeconomic values we would want to benefit through conservation and restoration of coastal areas. So coastal ecosystems and coastal ecosystem services are included in this optimization. This map has already informed investments on the part not only of the Nature Conservancy, but of other organizations in this region. And again, you can find more information about that at that web link. We published also a review of biodiversity conservation strategies, and we did this before the Lake Superior biodiversity conservation strategy had been started. So it covers 4 out of the 5, and you can look up this publication. And in this publication, we assessed the commonality, the common threats, and the viability across all 4 lakes. We assessed the approaches that were taken in those 4 biodiversity strategies, and also made some recommendations for future consideration of biodiversity conservation in the Great Lakes. So I mentioned all 5 are now done. Lake Superior was completed in 2015, and you can access these. And I thought I had a, I believe I do have a web link further on. So they are all now complete, and they're all being incorporated in one way or another into the lake-wide action and management plans. Yes, and there is the link where you can find those biodiversity conservation strategies. And now I'm going to finish up just with a few thoughts about the Nature Conservancy again. If you want to learn more, you can check out from Michigan. We have an audio tour at the Nan Weston Nature Preserve. I don't imagine any of you are close to Southeast Michigan, but if you are, you can look that up. And unfortunately, that didn't come through. You can become a member. There are multiple benefits of membership. And if you want to become a member in Michigan, this is the web link. You can also find any location if you just go to nature.org and find your local operating unit. Also, you can contact me or get in touch with our office. You can follow us on social media or visit us online. And that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take any questions for anyone who's online.
All right, thanks, Doug. That was great. I admit my internet dropped for a few minutes. I was off, but we've got this recorded, and I'll be able to go back and see it.
Sorry.
There's a couple other people here on the line, and they've been chatting in the chat box, so they might type in questions there. So you might want to drop out of full screen. But
okay.
I have a
All right, I
couple
see that
questions
now.
for Doug. One is the Asian carp
Sure.
issue. I know is of great concern, particularly I guess for Lake Michigan, because if it's going to be introduced, that sounds like where it's going to come from first. What is your opinion on the prognosis of keeping that species or that group of species out of the Great Lakes? It seems to me it's kind of dim.
That depends on who you ask. There have already been, boy, I'm not the AIS expert, but in a couple of tributaries of Lake Erie, there already have been confirmed. Yeah, the Lake Erie waters are actually more well suited than Lake Michigan. And the Illinois River is not the only connection, the Illinois and Chicago River. It's the one that's getting the most attention, obviously, but there are connections in Ohio, in Ontario, in Wisconsin as well. And there are people monitoring all of those. There's a basin-wide survey effort. If you go to blueaccounting.org and go to the aquatic invasive species issue, there's actually an interactive map. It was just posted about a month ago, where you can assess the vulnerability of different areas for invasion. And by, they're thinking about vectors like, boats, as well as, geez, again, I'm not the expert. I shouldn't
That's okay. I just
provide,
I just
shouldn't go beyond beyond my knowledge here. But that application would provide you with a lot of information. Now, the Army Corps just released a plan for what's called the Chicago Area Waterway System. And it's a really controversial issue. I know some of our colleagues here are pretty skeptical about it, that there are better ideas that have been floated but again, I can't speak to that in much detail because I'm not directly involved in that at all. So if you're interested, I encourage you to, that Army
is that an
Corps
EIS
recommendation
or
I'm sure has been published. You
how is
can
it
look it
done?
up. Boy, I would do a Google on the
All right, I'll
Chicago
have to look
Area
it up
Waterway
and see.
System or Asian
The
Carp
other question I
Prevention
had was
Plan.
you, you
I
talked
don't have
about,
that at my
restoration of
fingertips. Sorry.
wetlands. Is the goal to restore what was there or more than what was there? Uh,
Now, that's a great question, and one that it's very hard for anyone to get agreement on what the goal should be. Nobody has suggested that it's even possible to restore for Lake Erie what was there. Across the Great Lakes, roughly half of Great Lakes wetlands have been converted or destroyed. So there's over 500,000 acres of coastal wetlands in the Great Lakes. So there were over 1 million. And Lake Erie has lost the most. There are other areas. Sandusky Bay has also in Lake Huron. So the goal might differ. For example, in Lake Superior, it might be feasible to say we'd like to make sure that 90 or even 100% of the coastal wetlands remain viable. It's not
I can't help
really a
but
feasible
notice
goal for Lake Erie, so
the
it will
analogy
differ.
between what you're dealing with and I work in the marine environment in Florida, and with the loss of wetlands, the problems, the
Uh-huh.
goals, the solutions are in parallel. They're just it's the difference between a saltwater environment and a freshwater environment.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
There are a lot of parallels. The services provided
Yeah.
by
Oh,
coastal
absolutely.
wetlands,
Yeah.
a lot of
It's
them are very similar or the
and you would
same.
expect that because the systems, the ecosystems are similar in how they function. They just the species are different. The physical conditions might be different, but the relationships that are there are similar. It's interesting. I was been interesting to hear this because I don't get to hear a lot about freshwater stuff very often.
Ah, right. Well, happy to
I guess
share
Vanessa
it.
didn't have any questions, Tim. So uh,
Doug, I was just wondering, I guess, if I had the general sort of outline right. So you made this, well, you and everyone else you worked with made this strategy, and this goes to feed into the lamps primarily, or just sort of into the management planning, and then at that level they decide what they're really going to focus on to do action, like target specific actions and do the work. Is that right? So what? Go on. I
Yeah,
just want to say,
yeah,
so then what, I guess,
yeah.
prompted you to make
And
these
oh, go ahead.
strategies, or, well,
No.
you and everyone else?
Yeah, so it was really driven by the partners, the US EPA and Environment Canada, um, and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. In the 2012 amendment of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, that mandated that each lamp address biodiversity conservation. Now, that was after these had already been started, but the commitment to doing this and then the funding to do it came before that. Um, so there was a commitment to doing this, and I can't say where that was initiated, but it was with the International Joint Commission and um, the parties
Wow, okay, I see. So
that
it
are
was sort of just
responsible
like
for managing the Great
the
Lakes.
powers that be kind of decided or realized that this is an important issue that needs to be worked
Yeah,
on.
and I'm
Was there like a number of reports about
yeah,
issues with biodiversity in the Great Lakes before this?
And yeah, and yes, Great Lakes coastal wetlands, for example, have been a focal issue for more than 2 decades. And, um, I would say starting in the 60s, really, people were noticing the decline in coastal wetlands. Um, and so there's been an increasing amount of research on coastal wetlands. The Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Consortium was founded in the late 80s, early 90s, and they really initiate a lot of the foundational research around coastal wetlands, and I know that has been um, coastal wetlands have really been a focus on for biodiversity conservation, and I think they have brought along with that the other components of
Okay,
biodiversity.
I see. Yeah, so it's a general sort of consensus, I guess, in ways that just people are starting to pay attention to it. I guess this is sort of
yeah,
similar to the topic we've gotten on with our coastal wetlands research with the living shorelines. But um,
Mm-hmm. Sure. And that's not to say that the other pieces of biodiversity haven't also gotten attention, but I think coastal wetlands really has been a
okay,
major
so
focus.
and then I wanted to know, you mentioned that the current status of biodiversity in the lake that was measured in 2011, or you said it was dated. Is that continuously being assessed through any of the through the plan or by the management
right.
strategies?
Well, there is a comprehensive monitoring program for coastal wetlands. The reporting on that isn't great yet, but there through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, there is every 5 years a report on the state of the Great Lakes. Um, that just came out in 2017, and there is some alignment of some of the metrics or indicators in that report with these biodiversity conservation strategies. Now, the biodiversity conservation strategies have a much broader array of measures, and there is no coordinated effort to reassess all of those indicators. Some are being monitored, and every lake, on a rotating basis, does a what they call a coordinated science and monitoring initiative, and it rotates. 1 year it's in one lake, and then it goes to the next. And they set science priorities, and that will include some biodiversity. A lot of it is related to the trophic systems within the lakes, which are also under threat. So those are closely related. There have been some huge changes in the trophic dynamics in the Great Lakes related to aquatic invasives, but also to management decisions. Um, so I would say there's definitely not a
Okay, yeah,
coordinated effort
very.
to
I'm
update
sure.
these
I'm sure
assessments at
eventually,
this
I
point.
guess people are gonna have enough concern to be like, well, at this point, we were only fair. If we, we've committed this much resources to it, we probably want to know if we're better now by the same standard. I mean, I guess you would hope, right?
Doug, Doug, you just mentioned that,
Right.
I know the zebra mussel has affected the trophic conditions in the lake,
Yeah.
but what are the human ones? Is it just the further introduction of nutrients, or is it something more than that?
Well, um, those two factors intersect. There's a great book now that I'm reading. It's by Dan Egan. It's called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And it goes through a history of how invasive species, both intentionally and non-intentionally introduced, have changed in how people have responded. So, for example, the introduction of salmon was an attempt to both provide recreational fishing, it was wildly successful. So the salmon are not native to the upper Great Lakes. Atlantic salmon are native to Lake Ontario, but that was it, and they went extinct. But alewife, which is a fish not native to the Great Lakes, was introduced, arrived in the Great Lakes, and became super abundant.
Right, to eat them.
And so salmon were introduced as a way of capitalizing on that really abundant food source. And salmon proliferated, and it became a billion-dollar industry, the sport fishing industry in the Great Lakes. Well, now the mussels, zebra mussel, but then especially quagga mussel, which can survive much deeper. And so there's the abundance of quagga mussel is mind-boggling. And they're sucking out all the nutrients in Lakes Huron, Lake Michigan especially. And so those nutrients are not available to the bottom part of the food web, and there are other invasive species that are in that bottom part of the food web that are less palatable to some of the prey fish that would feed on them. And so there's a huge shift in biomass and in nutrient dynamics that has affected the food chain to the extent now that salmon crashed in Lake Huron. Those exotic salmon, you can't find them, and they are virtually gone, I believe, from Lake Michigan now, which in a way has provided lake trout with the opportunity to regain some of their population, which may be a good thing. It is a good thing from our perspective. And so there have just been these huge shifts, and it's not clear where it's going to land. Now the mussels are still there, and they are now part of the cycle that contributes to some of the harmful algal blooms by potentially recycling phosphorus.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not a
It's amazing
simple
how
system,
one species
and it has
can
been highly
create
altered.
so much change, but in an ecosystem. Yeah, the lamprey. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I left out the sea lamprey. The sea lamprey
Has the
decimated
lamprey
the lake trout,
population
and that was
crashed
another
as well or
incentive to
not?
bring in salmon.
It's
No, they are being controlled, but only because every year, I don't know if it's 10 or 20 million, there's an investment in sea lamprey
is that a
control
physical?
on both sides, the US and Canadian sides. There's a biocide, that was discovered a couple of decades ago that is really selective. It's a chemical that apparently only kills sea lamprey. And so they treat the tributary streams with lampricide to kill the juvenile lamprey. And if it weren't for that, yeah,
Wow, that's
the lamprey would be much more of a problem than they are now.
Yeah, that is complicated dynamics to try to control. I imagine that a lot of the efforts of this conservation program tie into each other, and they can be, I guess mutually dependent on each other. Like, you improve the coastal wetlands, you'll have some more filtration of nutrients, and hopefully control more of the non-point pollution. That's, create more habitat for, juvenile fish, etc. Right?
Yeah, certainly a lot of the strategies to reduce, for example, ag non-point source pollution will also improve stream habitat quality, and we recognize that. And so we want to be able to track progress in stream habitat quality while we're tracking progress on the
Cool.
phosphorus
Yeah.
concentration in the lake, for example,
But it
and
also
harmful
sounds
algal
like
blooms.
there's
Those
no
are definitely
clear
related.
end game for where you want the lakes to be, considering the fact that they're so messed up. Yeah.
Well, there for the phosphorus. There's a science-based goal for phosphorus load reductions for Lake Erie. There is one there. Now it's a huge goal. It'll take a lot of time and a lot of effort to get there, but it is a shared goal. There is a goal for coastal wetlands. It's not quantitative, but in the water quality agreement, the goal is for a net habitat gain, on every reporting cycle, right? So
As far as the fish
that
species
sounds,
goal,
it's not
your
quantitative,
goal,
but
I mean,
again, a
there
net
is no
habitat
goal
gain.
to restore lake trout, is there? Or is that right?
Lake trout are now spawning, and there are people working on that. I don't know if there's a quantitative goal for population levels. There may be. Um,
That's,
So
yeah,
what is I guess on sort of
complicated.
another topic then, or is Dr. T, are you talking? Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm done.
Okay, I guess I wanted to just sort of, I guess, talk about the whole. I mean, since you were like a lead author on this, can you tell us a little bit about, I guess the process of putting this all together? Like, I mean, it's a really big document, and clearly, like, a lot of different parties had to pull in to, create these.
yeah. Right. So yes, it took a very focused project management effort, and it wasn't just me. I had a lot of help, and we had a really good core team. So, in terms of managing the project, I had some help from a coordinator in our office, and my counterpart John Paskus with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and we established a regular schedule of calls with our steering committee, and our core team had regular calls, and we all had timelines and deliverables. We reported on those deliverables, all of those aspects of project management, which take time. That takes time in and of itself. Um, but it was a good team, and
Well,
we were
yeah,
committed to
definitely. And
getting it
so
done.
the
And
latest one that was made was in 2015, and I mean at that point you have all of the Great Lakes. So what's really next for, well, I guess, you and your team?
so I mentioned, there's follow up on many of the Great Lakes issues that are addressed in the biodiversity conservation strategies. There are local efforts that are recommended. So, for example, the Lake Superior biodiversity strategy, that I didn't participate in that one. That was led by Nature Conservancy Canada, working with the Lake Superior Partnership, and they identified watershed level um, status reports and priorities for watersheds throughout the Lake Superior Basin. So that provides, a little more specific direction for local actors. And I recently attended the State of Lake Superior meeting, and people were talking about how their actions contributed to some of the priorities identified in the biodiversity strategy. And that's really encouraging to hear that people involved in developing the strategy are then following up on it. To the extent that they can manage projects that contribute to biodiversity conservation. So we heard about wetland restoration, removal of barriers, wild rice cultivation, lots of different things that are related to biodiversity conservation strategy. And in blue accounting, we're talking, for coastal wetlands, that's the issue that I manage in blue accounting. Um, the biodiversity strategy will be important in how we report on progress. I will say that setting goals with a group of people, that's the hardest part. Getting people to agree on a goal is not easy, especially when those people are somewhat
Wow. Okay.
nervous about being held accountable to a goal. And when you have people who work for public agencies and some of whom are appointed by they get really nervous. So
Um, I
it's
mean, you
difficult
said
to
you're
do.
making progress in Detroit, though, doing a lot of work there. What has sort of led them to?
Well, yeah, there's work going on in Detroit. I'm not closely involved, so I can't speak to a lot of the detail, but we're working with the city and many other partners on what's called a watershed improvement district, where there are credits for, there's a couple of different things. One is there are um, ordinances that determine how much impervious surface can be on a newly developed property, for example, and you get credit for um, how much impervious surface or green infrastructure you incorporate into your new development. And I'm not involved, so I'm not going to get this right, but it's like that. So the idea is that to both create and have adopted policies that support green infrastructure over gray infrastructure, so that urban runoff is reduced and combined sewer overflows are reduced, and that would then benefit downstream waters. So in the case of Detroit, it's not really going to help their drinking water because they get their drinking water upstream in the Detroit River, and it's good water. It's coming from Lake Huron. So they get their water upstream, and then it goes through, people use it, and then it comes out on the downstream end after going through the Detroit and Wayne County sewage treatment plant. Um, the idea is to uh, improve green infrastructure and increase the amount of green infrastructure so that sewage treatment plant does not get overloaded in storms. And that's what a combined sewer overflow is during storm events, the sewage system can't handle it. So green infrastructure is a way of reducing those CSOs, improving water quality, and also improving the quality of life within the city, where you have more green open space that people enjoy, and it improves air quality, and it diminishes the heat island effect. So we're working on creative ways of financing more green infrastructure, of getting policies in place that support green infrastructure, um, and working with private partners
Right,
to
right. I imagine
demonstrate
it's
how
a
you
big,
do effective
big
green
topic to
infrastructure.
bring everyone in on and fund for sure. Um, all right, Doug. Well, we need to, I guess, bring this to some sort of conclusion. It's getting running a
Yeah.
little late. I know that there's a huge rush, but um, I wanted to thank you for coming out and sharing all this, sharing your presentation, and then speaking with us a little bit about your own journey and all of our follow-up questions. So thank you. And thanks for taking the time.
Thanks very much. Appreciate your
Well,